Hi, I'm Jennifer Brown, editor of Canadian Lawyer In-House magazine, and I'm joined here today by Ralph Croman of Weirfolds LLP. In this version of the Weirfolds quiz, we're talking about managing cybersecurity risk in contracts. Many companies acquire third-party IT services from organizations that will host and acquire often confidential information from organizations. Most standard form contracts will seek to minimize any liability the company may face in the event of a breach of confidential information. So Ralph, let's say that a section of the contract indicates that the standard of care that the third party would provide is the same level of confidentiality that it would provide to its own information. What's the best provision to add to make sure that the service provider would be responsible for all breaches of information from the organization?
Well, Jen, the best provision to add is a so-called strict liability provision. In other words, you could add a provision that says the service provider must keep the confidential information of the company strictly confidential and must just not disclose it to any third party. By doing so, the service provider will be liable for security breaches, even if it complies with the standard of care regarding using appropriate security levels to safeguard the confidential information.
And if you're successful in negotiating robust confidentiality obligations and an indemnity, is your work done in the contract to make sure that you will have full recovery of the data in the event of a security breach?
Well, no, it depends on the contract. Many and probably most contracts nowadays contain exclusions and limitations of liability. Exclusions of liability typically say that the service provider is not liable for breaches of confidentiality to the extent that consequential damages may arise or loss of data may arise. So that exclusion of liability can often undermine the confidentiality indemnity provisions. In addition, it's quite common to see a monetary cap in the exclusions of liability. And that monetary cap will typically say something like the service provider's obligations under the contract, if they're breached, the service provider's liability is limited to a dollar amount that's typically expressed as a multiple of the fees. For example, it might say the liability is fixed at 12 months of prior fees paid to the service provider. So the issue is that those robust confidentiality indemnity provisions may be undermined by the exclusions and limitations of liability. So it's really important then when we're working on the contract to review those exclusions and limitations of liability, determine if they apply to the confidentiality provisions and the indemnities, and then carve out or negotiate carve-outs to the extent necessary.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. For more on this and other issues related to managing contracts and cybersecurity issues, please see the January issue of Canadian Lawyer In-House magazine.